Unit 11 is an introduction to feminist ethics, an endeavour to show students something of the significant development of feminist scholarship in the area of ethics since the 1970s. In this unit, we'll be examining some of the factors which led to the 1970s development of feminist philosophy and feminist ethics. We'll be looking at some of the perspectives and experiences that male philosophers did not seem to take into account, at least sufficiently and significantly. We'll recognise that some of the experiences that have caused the development of feminist ethics or brought it to the forefront have been experiences that are not shared by men over against women. In other words, women have some unique experiences which men don't have, or experience challenges. We'll look at some key elements of a working definition of feminist ethics as these seems to be unfolding today. And we'll look at the perspectives and views that seem to be contained within the idea of feminist ethics. And then we'll try to look at some of the challenges for feminist ethics as it moves forward into the future. Let's begin by looking at some of the traditional views of women from about 600 BC through to about 1970. Aristotle is infamous for his comment about the male by nature superior and the female inferior. One rules and the other is ruled. Very definite ruling and authoritative position. Cato has a similar view, so has Aquinas, Immanuel Kant. But the most significant is that set forth by Rousseau. Not the most significant, but the most important, because it became a point of tension in his era between a particular writer and himself who challenged the view being expressed of male superiority. It may appear that up to the time of the 1970s there was a consistent, common, contemptuous view of women. That would not be quite accurate. For example, there were some voices that were contrary to that. Most notable, perhaps, was Plato. In the Republic, Plato wanted women to be treated in every way the same as men. And he came up in the Republic first with some principles. The first is the first point made here, that women must be taught the same thing as men and must do the same work, be able to do the same work as men. And as a result of that, when he divided society in the Republic into three levels, the philosopher kings and queens, the guardians, and the remainder of society, it was the guardians who were the police or the army who enforced the rule of the philosopher kings and queens. And it was from their class that the philosopher kings and queens were selected. So it's not surprising that while he recognises the male being stronger in some respects than women, and women being weaker in relation to men, he says they have the same nature, same ability to be guardians, same ability to be philosopher kings and queens. This is extremely radical in his time. But what's particularly interesting, as a matter of passing interest almost, is that he has a thesis that the thing that seems to be stopping women from being fully involved in education, fully involved in their careers, and in any aspect of society, including the military, is childbearing. And he wants to remove that from women, give that to professional nurses so that women are free to be fully involved. In other words, he says children are the stumbling block for women being equally involved. It's an interesting thesis, and if you're interested in following that, the Republic is worth reading for that reason, if no other. There were other voices of dissent, if you will. Linda Belleville suggests that virtually every leadership role in the New Testament, particularly the post-Gospel New Testament, names women in those roles, and while it may be a controversial position, in her well-established book, Women in Ministry, an Egalitarian Perspective, it was edited by James Beck, I beg your pardon, she argues this very vociferously. And she has a number of scriptural texts. I've written a couple of them there for you, where you can see that there is a non-authority. While women are required to submit to their husbands, submission is a very different thing from obedience in the context of the New Testament. There are a number of other scholars, particularly in the East and West. I haven't taken them, but however, they're still left with a simple fact that largely the experiences and the contributions and perspectives of women were ignored or devalued in academic study of philosophy and ethics. Now, that's not entirely true, because there are some notable exceptions. Women invading the philosophical arena. I've listed some of them for you here. Aspasia, who was the partner of the very famous Greek statesman Pericles, and the mother of Pericles the Younger. It is well known that she conducted her house in such a way as it was a place for scholars to assemble. And by the way, Socrates was one of the scholars who visited that house and was involved with her, so it's an interesting background. Hypatia of Alexandria, after whom a present-day feminist ethics magazine is named after, she was a philosopher and astronomer and mathematician, and lived in the influence in the eastern part of the empire. And Conway, sometimes Viscountess Conway, she was influential with the Cambridge Platonists, and interesting enough, she had influence on Leibniz, a modern era male philosopher, which is interesting in itself. But the most significant, perhaps, in the flow of these is Mary Wollstonecraft. She's a figure that has to be taken into account, and she specifically fought for gender equality. She wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and she is the one who's particularly addressed the theories of Rousseau. They are somewhat contemporaries, and she is debating his contribution. I think you all know of Susan Anthony and the women's suffrage movement. Some of you may have known of Jean-Paul Sartre, who was a French existentialist, the early part of last century. His partner, come girlfriend, the varying type of open relationship they had, but she was very active in the existential movement and writing with him as well. And last is an illustration, Ayn Rand. I previously referred to her in some other classes, and her work, well, it stands on its own merit. But of course, it's debated whether or not she was technically a feminist. She didn't especially address the feminist issue. Well, all that is to say that the past was not all black, but it certainly was nowhere near white. It was nowhere near a place where women were fully accepted and integrated, both socially and academically, in the area of philosophy in particular, and of ethics, which concerns this class and this particular unit. Some interesting observations. Women are clearly moral equals to men. And clearly, everyone's experience deserves respect. It was perspective. So it must include women as well. And if we exclude any group, women or minority, then to the extent philosophy ignores those experiences and background, then the discussion is going to be incomplete. It's an interesting observation, I think, this third bullet. I've taken this almost entirely from the textbook, because I think this was outstanding. I don't think I wrote here the recognition of it. Schaefer Dow deserves it. I think he put this very, very well. The traditional qualities and traits associated with women are as important as those traits associated with men. In other words, because women are loving and empathetic and sharing and caring, surely they are just as valuable as the strengths and characteristics of men. And lastly, moral reasoning is part of the discussion of ethics. And that means that we need to take into account the way people reason about morality. And often you'll find that women reason differently and very constructively. It is said that they emphasize cooperation and flexibility and openness, and tend to put family needs first and friendships and relationships ahead of cold, stark principles. And that's worthy of note in terms of understanding the whole role of women and men. Well, that brings us to the 1970s and the rise of modern feminism. What's important to begin here is to understand that the movement to about 1970 had been a political rights movement. It had gained the vote for women, equal rights for women, movement toward equal pay for equal work. But in the area of philosophy and ethics, there had not been great attention paid to what women thought, nor a recognition of the uniqueness of women's contribution. A psychologist, not a philosopher, a psychologist, Carol Gilligan, in 1982 wrote a book, In a Different Voice. And in that book, she argued that women have a distinctive way of thinking about morality, which hasn't been regarded in the moral discussions up to that point in time. Feminist philosophers began to pick up Gilligan's ideas and concept and began to use that as an approach to challenging traditional approaches to ethics. And behind that challenge was this recognition that the female perspective came out of some experiences that are commonly shared by women, but uncommonly shared by men. For example, women are more vulnerable to rape than men. Vast difference. Women are far more likely to be subject to domestic abuse. Women clearly have been excluded from many professions, quite unfairly. And women are largely living in a state of economic dependency. If you have followed through on the problems of women living in an abusive relationship, the question, why don't they leave that relationship? One of the profound factors is they're financially dependent upon their male partner who is abusing them. And as a result of all these things, there's a degree of diminished autonomy, a sense in which a woman is not as free as a man. And this was an issue of concern to the feminists, and they wanted to develop it. Well, it brings us to the question of, well, what is feminist ethics? It's sometimes said in a simplistic way that the difference between feminist ethics and other approaches to ethics is the concept of care, particularly maternal care, and the moral relationships based on that. And that is true. It's clearly there. But I think Heidi Lindemann, emeritus professor from Michigan State University, who wrote the introduction to a very significant anthology on feminist ethics, published in 2005, she makes some interesting comments here that are worthy of understanding. She said that the feminist ethic aims to understand, to criticise and correct how gender operates within our moral beliefs and practices, and also the methodological approaches to ethical theory. And she sets out three factors that seem to be common now. Not all feminists share these 3 points, but not all feminist ethicists share these 3 points, but they're certainly there in a great majority. The first is they're concerned about the issue of binary view of gender. Second is the privileges historically available to men, and the ways that various views about gender maintain oppressive social orders. The way you think about gender tends to oppress women, especially young girls. um, and in terms of sexuality and gender identity. She goes on to say that oppression is often ignored in terms of the issues concerning women, that they are oppressed. And have different approaches to feminism, have a different desire to deal with this area. Now, not all share in the binary view of gender or the struggle over that issue. That doesn't need to worry us particularly today, because we're just trying to introduce a working definition and give us some sense of where we're going. Now, when feminist ethics takes place, well, what comes out of that? Well, there's some very important feminist publications. Indeed, there's a plethora of new feminist publications, both in the area of philosophy and ethics. And I've just listed some here for you, if you're interested in following through on these. These are key and well known. Each of the societies mentioned here do publish a journal. In fact, some publish more than one journal. So I'll leave those with you. I'm not going to go through them. Once feminist ethicists start writing, you begin to see there are some things that seem to be common elements. There seems to be a rejection of the unification of ethics under a supreme moral principle. In other words, while the good life might be a concern, as we've seen with other ethical systems and ethical theories, they are registered a supreme moral principle which will be pressed down and become the guardian or the governing principle out of which the ethical theories developed. They often question the impartiality and abstraction that comes from traditional ethical theories. All the ethical theories I've looked at to date have tried to be objective or impartial in the way they apply to people. Think of independent observers and ideal observers and the like. These theories value consistency and impartiality to these abstract principles. But women, on the other hand, seem to value partiality. They're concerned about their family and their loved ones. And they're very situationally oriented. So the desire to be consistent in over every situation is not a huge issue. Inconsistencies between situations can be acceptable. Of course, the ethics of care is a good thing. It values cooperation. It downvalues competitiveness. And indeed, they would like to see competitive situations turned into cooperative ones. And many feminists seem to reject the concept of rights that are the foundation of a number of ethical theories, and emphasise our mutual responsibilities one to the other. Quite an interesting set of developments and very interesting and helpful. But feminist ethics does have some challenges. If you tend to focus on situations and families, then in terms of care and mothering, there's a possibility here that the scope of the moral community might be affected, particularly in terms as a number of ethical theories are being concerned to move the moral community to include sentient beings such as animals. It may be a challenge for feminist ethics. It may not, but it's something to concern oneself. The other thing is emotion. The role and relationship of emotion. Now, feminist ethics aren't afraid of emotion. They have to talk about it. But the question is, how can emotion guide us in knowing what's the right thing to do? And that's a topic that needs a lot of reflection. Again, because emotion is nebulous and it's inherently subjective to the individual and the situation. Can it work as a social ethic? And how does it work as a social ethic? Impartiality seems to be more important in some contexts, but not a significant one. We've already noted that. Well, that's something we've already indicated as a challenge. If you reject the idea of a supreme moral rule or set of rules, then how does your ethical theory hold together? How does it actually work as a total system in the social context? And while corporate is a wonderful thing, and having an ethic which has cooperation as goal and arrangement, how do you deal with people who are just obstinate and won't cooperate? And how do you deal with the morality of that? How do you know when it's right to compel cooperation, when it's not right to compel cooperation? Although justice and rights are not the whole of morality, feminist ethic does have to take into account justice and rights. It's an important part of it. I've taken this list somewhat from Schaeffer and Dow's and modified it from my own perspective, but nonetheless, they're very similar indeed. Well, what do you need to take from this unit? This is an introductory unit, an overview of feminist ethics. What you need to come out of this with, as far as the course is concerned, is you should be aware of some of the experience and perspectives of women which have not been taken into account in the past. And be aware of some of the experiences widely shared among women, which are not common among men. It's very important, I think, especially for men to appreciate that. Have an idea of the key elements of the working definition of feminist ethics. And understand the key perspectives contained that come out of feminist ethics. And know some of the challenges which I've suggested and which the Tao suggests are things you should consider for the ongoing development of feminist ethics. Thank you for watching the video.